So for as long as white Charlestonians have been putting up monuments to white power and white supremacy, black Charlestonians have been protesting those monuments. And there's obviously many historical lies, and specifically Confederate lies, that this city and this country tell itself. But today I'm going to talk about the myth that black resistance to Confederate monuments is new. And the starting point for that correction is John C. Calhoun. So Calhoun was a US representative for South Carolina. He was Secretary of War under James Monroe, Vice President under both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, Secretary of State under John Tyler, and he died in office as a US Senator in 1850. And, fun fact, he was also reported to be the great uncle of singer Lena Horne. Her full name was actually Lena Mary Calhoun Horne. But what Calhoun is most remembered for today is the fierceness with which he fought for the right for white people to own black human beings. And a quotable quote from Calhoun is a statement he made in 1837 when he called the enslavement of black people, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good. He went on to say, "Never before has the black race of Central Africa, from the dawn of history to the present day, attained a condition so civilized and improved, not only physically and morally, but intellectually, than during slavery." Anyway, so Calhoun dies in 1850 of tuberculosis, and there's a huge funeral procession, reportedly 2 miles long, stretching through Charleston streets. And then if you look at newspaper accounts, there's a lot of ink spilled about people mourning. But you know who wasn't mourning? Black Charlestonians, who made up the majority of the city at that time. So Swedish novelist Fredrika Bremer was in Charleston, and she wrote, quote, "During the procession, a whole crowd of Negroes leaped about the streets, looking quite entertained." She also wrote that an enslaved man had been overheard saying, "Calhoun was indeed a wicked man, for he wished that we might remain slaves." Elijah Green was an enslaved 7-year-old black boy at the time, and he was one of the 5 black men and boys who had to dig Calhoun's grave. He told an interviewer in 1937, "I never did like Calhoun because he hated the Negro. No man was as hated as him by a group of people." But before Calhoun could even arrive at the gates of hell, the Ladies Calhoun Monument Association started to plan to build a monument to him. And they were offered other spaces, but they chose the Citadel Green, which is now known as Marion Square, and that wasn't incidental. It's because the old Citadel was built as a guardhouse and an arsenal to shoot down any uprising of enslaved black folks after Denmark Vesey's rebellion in 1822. So this is how the statue looked when it was erected in February 1887. There's Calhoun up high on his perch. It's about 45 feet high. At his feet is a statue of the woman who is supposed to represent justice. And these were apparently ugly statues, frankly. People instantly criticized them. I don't have any close-ups for obvious reasons from the era. So instead, I'm showing you a close-up of another hideous statue of another notorious racist, Nathan Bedford Forrest. But it was really the black community that made the Calhoun statue an object of derision and ridicule, though one newspaper said that Calhoun's weirdly shaped index finger looked like a deformity. Someone else, and I'm quoting, called it an abortion, and the News and Courier called it an eyesore. But it was the black community that really made Calhoun an object of derision and ridicule, because it was clear that this statue was about pushing back against black rights gained during Reconstruction and as Jim Crow was starting. So Mamie Garvin Fields, who was a black South Carolinian teacher, was born 1 year after the Calhoun Monument went up, and she spent her early childhood in its shadow. And she wrote in her memoirs, "Black people took that statue personally. As you passed by, here was Calhoun looking you in the face and telling you, 'You may not be a slave, but I am back to see you stay in your place.'" I believe white people were talking to us about Jim Crow through that statue. Keep in mind that Calhoun went up in 1887. This is the post-Reconstruction period in the South. It is one of the bloodiest eras of Ku Klux Klan violence and white terror against black folks. And yet black Charlestonians somehow found ways to protest this ode to slaveholding and violence in their midst, despite the risk that doing so obviously presented. So they did it through satire and mockery. The Guller community referred to the supposedly glorified, grand statue of justice that stood at Calhoun's feet dismissively as he wife and as Miss Calhoun. And that kind of mockery was a way of turning it into a mundane statue that signified nothing. And they also used defacement as a means of protest. Mamie Garvin Fields says later in that same memoir, we used to carry something with us if we knew we'd be passing that way in order to deface that statue, scratch up the coat, break the watch chain, try to knock off the nose. And this kind of defacement kept happening over and over and over. In 1888, the justice figure was found one morning with, this is from a newspaper article from the era, a tin kettle in her hand and a cigar in her mouth. A few years later, in 1892, someone protested by painting the figure of Justice white. And in December 1894, a young black boy named Andrew Haig shot at the figure of Justice with a tiny pistol. On Thanksgiving Day in 1895, Calhoun was finally removed. A group of young Gullah boys apparently turned out to watch the crew as they worked, and according to a News and Courier article from the era, as the statue of Calhoun was being lowered from the pedestal, one of the boys, quote, skillfully pasted Mr. Calhoun in the eye with a lump of mud. The Ladies Calhoun Memorial Association, of course, they end up selling it for scrap, except for the weirdly shaped finger, which is now in the Charleston Museum. In 1896, another Calhoun monument, the one that still stands today in Marion Square, was put up, and this time, the pedestal is about 115 feet in the air. So officially, the reason for removing the Calhoun statue is because of aesthetics, right? But Mamie Garvin Fields goes on to say later in her memoir, quote, children and adults beat up John C. Calhoun so badly that the whites had to come back and put him up so high so we couldn't get to him. And according to historical accounts, that kind of vandalism went on for years, like way into the mid-20th century. And I wanted to talk about this today because these stories of black resistance, large and small, from slavery and beyond, they often don't get told because we have this narrative of pure degradation. But the full story is that black folks have consistently fought for their freedom in this country, often under the threat of serious terror and violence. And that often dangerous work of envisioning freedom has benefited every American, and it's honestly the only reason why this country has ever come close to living up to its promise. Thank you.